Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another installment of the Jewish Destiny series, the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and if you're just joining for the first time, either with us on Zoom or on one of the streams or later on to our anytime, this is a perfect time to jump into the Jewish Destiny series because we are turning a new page on Jewish history, beginning a new chapter, if you will, on Jewish history, and delving into what is commonly known as the Second Commonwealth, what in Hebrew we would refer to as Bayis Sheni, the time period of the Second Temple, beginning in the year roughly 350, and we will go on until the year 70 when the Second Temple will be destroyed, and that will all be what we refer to as the Second Commonwealth. So let's delve right in and get started. We're in the middle of a very busy week, as you probably know from previous sessions of me telling you about what's coming up. And if you find the emails, and you know, we're on to our new night, Wednesday nights for the Jewish Destiny series, which will be henceforth. So I hope everyone will continue to join us on Wednesday nights. And let's delve right into tonight's topic. I put the topic there in the chat box beforehand, and if anyone came in a little bit later, we'll post it one more time. And here it is one more time. And let's do it. Okay, so we began to introduce the topic of the Jews going back to build the Second Temple and to begin to build the Second Commonwealth. And it was a process, as things usually are in life, that went over the course of many years. The original blessing, the original decree, if you will, that said the Jews can return to Israel and rebuild their temple was a decree by Cyrus. And it was the plan was not for it in any way, shape, or form to be an independent state. The plan was for it to be a vassal of the Persian Empire. But nonetheless, it was the green light to build the temple. That was thwarted by the not so good Samaritans. A moratorium went into place. The moratorium remained in place through the Purim story. And then in the events following the Purim story, most notably the king Darius, probably Darius II, quite possibly Esther's son, was in his ascent to the throne, one of the things that he allowed was the Jews to once again go back and continue construction on the Second Temple, again, as a vassal to the Persian Empire. So the country would not be independent, but the Jews would at least have their own temple. Now, some of the laws, if you will, that Cyrus put into place to be able to represent the fact that Israel was not an independent state is that he said, even though you're allowed to go back and even though you're allowed to build your temple, you may not put a wall around Jerusalem. The idea being that in antiquity, a wall was your security. That represented your greatest barrier of strength. So by Jerusalem not being allowed to put up a wall and therefore remaining vulnerable to anyone and everyone, it also left them subservient to the Persians, and we'll see the Persian army, and it left them needing the help of the Persian army, and very much left them in control of the Persians. Now, there's one thing that I've said numerous times, and as I was preparing for tonight's session, you know, contrary to popular belief, I don't just come in here and start running my mouth about history. I always like to review and review the content and look into questions that I've had and see if I can come up with better answers. And there's something that started bothering me. There's a statement that I've made numerous times that we, in the year 2021, are the first Jews since the destruction of the first temple who can say that we see the majority of the world Jewish population living in Israel. Because during the Second Temple, at no point was the majority of the world Jewish population living in Israel, meaning the outposts, if you will, in diaspora were so strong at this point, especially in Babylon, that the majority of the Jewish population does not return. That's my statement that you've all probably heard from me many a times. And in truth, it's not mine. It comes from our sages. It comes according to the words of many of our commentaries, many of the famous commentaries on the Tanakh, on the Jewish Bible. But something started, so to speak, not to add up in my head. And that was, if we look at Jeremiah's account of the exile of the Jewish people, Jeremiah seems to say that there were somewhere between maybe 20 to 40,000 Jews in Babylon. that was the total of the exiles from Judah to Babylon was anywhere from 20 to 40,000, depending on how you count. He gives a number of 20,000. That was probably according to the average Jewish census, which was only males between the ages of 20 and 60. So therefore, we can extrapolate that 20,000 was probably a lot more once you figure in the women, children, and senior citizens. So somewhere like 40,000. But be it as it may, it's a small number. It's a very small number, considering that if we look at the Jewish population of the country at the time of King David, right before the zenith of the First Commonwealth, David takes a census that is recorded in the book of Samuel and in the book of Chronicles, where there are 1.5 million Jewish males between the age of 20 and 16, meaning Jewish males who could be of army service. So that's roughly, again, if you extrapolate that, 3 million plus, once you figure in everybody else. So that's the census that King David gives, that at the height of this country, before the country splits, there were about 3 million people. So what this would mean a couple of things. The number one, that would mean that there's an attrition of, do your math, 2,900,960,000 Jews roughly from the time that David is king until the time that the first temple is destroyed and all the Jews are in the Babylonian exile, which is a pretty depressing thought. And it raises a number of questions. Number one, we're going to see that there's tremendous population growth once again during the Second Commonwealth, that different accounts are the Jews can make up anywhere from 1 million to 5 million to maybe even 10 million, according to some accounts. And this is when the whole Roman Empire, which we'll get to at the end of the Second Commonwealth, was all of 60 million people. So, if you talk about the Jews, let's say, if we go in the middle, say the Jews were 5 million, we were 10% of the Roman Empire. And that's a tremendous population growth, talking about a population from under 100,000 to maybe upwards of 5 million. So this started bothering me a little bit. And when we add to that Ezra gives us the number of those who return to Israel at a hair under 43,000, and that probably was including everybody, men, women, children, everybody. And we couple that with the fact that we say that was only a minority of the population. So again, that means there must have been at least 44,000 that didn't come back. And usually minorities aren't just like 49%, unless it's politics. Minorities are usually, 20%, 10%, I don't know. So it leads us to believe that there must have been more Jews in Babylon than were exiled at the time that the Babylonians sacked the first temple and destroyed the First Commonwealth. So I believe the way we can reconcile this, I discussed this with a few of my historian friends today, is to say that there's something that's not accounted for in Jeremiah's account, and that is the remnants of the 10 tribes. If you recall, the 10 northern tribes, the kingdom of Israel, was destroyed 150 years before Judah, Jerusalem, and the temple. And we talked about how there's a whole, the members of that community were dispersed. Some were lost forever, some were lost temporarily. But be it as it may, what I think we have to say is that there was a strong amount of that number that ends up in Babylon. And especially as the Jewish community starts to coalesce in Babylon, they gravitate there. So even though we maybe only had 40,000 that went from Judah, Jerusalem, the southern kingdom to Babylon, they were probably met by tens of thousands of others who were coalescing around the community from the northern tribes, the quote unquote 10 lost tribes. And therefore, that when we have a number of roughly 43,000 going back to build the Second Commonwealth, my hunch is they probably left somewhere around 100,000 in Babylon. That's going to be my rough guess of numbers. Again, we're still going to have to talk about this major population growth, and we'll get to that in later sessions, but that's the demographic now. That's the demographic that we have, as we mentioned before, the spatterings of small Jewish communities elsewhere in the exile. The majority, we'll call it 100,000, are in Babylon, and 43,000 go with Ezra back to Israel to build the Second Commonwealth. And it is a very difficult process. The not so good Samaritans make it impossible. They're threatening them. And finally, Nehemiah, Nehemiah had a very significant position in the Persian government. He was what in Hebrew is referred to as the Tsar Hamaskim, which in English is often translated as the Chamberlain or the cupbearer. But if we want to extrapolate modern politics to politics of antiquities, he was the national security advisor, because whomever was the cupbearer for the king or the chamberlain was basically either the head of the Secret Service or the national security advisor, because it was his job to make sure the drink of the king wasn't poisoned. That was his job. And that's why it was such a significant role in antiquity. And this role was that of Nehemiah. So as the Second Commonwealth is having its difficulties getting off the ground, Ezra appeals back to Nehemiah, says, we need help over here. We need to build up the situation, and we're having a very hard time doing it. So what happens is Nehemiah appeals to the Persian king. He says, I know I'm the, this lofty position in the government over here, but my brethren in Jerusalem are having a very hard time. And I have 3 requests. Number 1, can I join them in Jerusalem? Number 2, I know that you originally said they could not build a wall, but can you basically find it in your heart to let them build a wall, to allow them to build the wall? And request number 3 was, and I need the help of the Persian army. So these were lofty, bold requests for Nehemiah to make to the king. And requests like this could have only had one of 2 responses, either yes or off with your head. But the king agreed with Nehemiah, let him return to Jerusalem to help out Ezra, let him take a Persian army, let him build up the walls of Jerusalem. So finally, with Nehemiah's help, we see that the community starts to get some stability. So basically, when we look at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth, we have 2 leaders at the helm. We have Ezra, who essentially is the spiritual leader, and we have Nehemiah, who's the provincial leader, who brought the physical security to the country. Now, you might be asking, as we discussed before, a character by the name of Zerubbabel, who was the heir apparent. In other words, the idea was that if the Jews would be able to really reinstitute the monarchy, that Zerubbabel was a descendant of David and would become the king. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah, the Commonwealth, made many appeals back to Darius, back to Persia, to allow them to call Zerubbabel the king. He'd be a puppet king. He'd be a vassal king. They'd remain part of the empire. But they made every effort that they could to get Zerubbabel to be considered the king of Israel. But every single request that they made was denied by the Persian government and the Persian throne. And eventually, Zerubbabel probably goes back to Persia. He probably doesn't even remain, because we see that after all these requests that he should be king, he disappears from the scene of Jewish history. So we're left with Ezra and Nehemiah leading the country. Ezra being the religious leader and Nehemiah being the provincial leader. So now Ezra is famous for a number of things. So first of all, when he gets back to Israel after this whole period, roughly the 10-year period of the moratorium, or 15-year period of the moratorium being removed, those who originally went were in a state of depression. They had given up hope on a Jewish community in Israel, and the Talmud tells us that they had given up observance of the commandments of the Torah, that they had stores that were open on Shabbos, that they had intermarried, that they had strayed very, very far from the Jewish core. So Ezra, on top of all these difficulties from the not so good Samaritans, trying to get the temple built, trying to get the country going, he has to deal with the spiritual level of the people. And he does it successfully. He brings the Jews back, gets them to divorce the non-Jewish wives, gets them to close their stores on Shabbos, and is able to very rapidly, through sheer personality, dedication, reaching out to the people, Jewish outreach, whatever you want to call it, he is able to uplift the spiritual nature of the community. And there's a number of things that he is also famous for in this process of trying to invigorate the community. And one of them is Ezra gives a greater form to our Torah reading as we know it. Now, I wrote an article on this maybe about a year ago, maybe about 2 years ago. I'm going to drop the link here in the chat box for anyone who wants it. If anyone later is watching this on Torah Anytime or social media and you want the link, it can be found at rabbilandis.com under the section of writings. And it is an article on the evolution of public Torah reading as we know it. The public Torah reading that we all enjoy on a tri-weekly basis in synagogue. And this explains sort of the evolutionary process that Torah reading went through. I'll summarize it very quickly, but you can read the article if you're more interested. That essentially what we had was, at the time of Moses, before Moshe passed away, there was already a concept of public Torah reading. In other words, the original concept of Torah reading was an enactment of Moshe. Now, the question is, what did that look like? And it was very different than what we have. And it was probably very sparse, very little, and it was done 3 times a week. So the reading of the Torah on Monday, Thursday, and Shabbos was instituted by Moshe. But it was most likely a very minimal reading of the Torah. Ezra institutes 2 things. Ezra institutes that the Shabbos afternoon reading of the Torah, the Mincha service, because he felt that the people who worked during the week didn't necessarily make it to synagogue, and they should have 2 different Torah readings on one Shabbos. So you would read the weekly reading in the morning and the preview of the following week in the afternoon. And that was one institution he made. The other institution Ezra makes was that he requires that when the Torah is read, that a minimum of 10 verses must be read from a minimum of 3 readers. Now, this was back in the day before the concept of what we call a Bal Koreh, or a Torah reader, and because the way the Torah reading was originally done from Moses to Ezra and really until modern times is someone would be called up to the Torah and they wouldn't just say the blessings as is usually done nowadays. And then you have the Torah reader, the Bal Koreh, read the Torah, but the person called up would actually read the Torah. That was what was done. And so Ezra says you need to call up a minimum of 3 people who have to read a minimum of 3 verses every time you read the Torah. But he also instituted a level of sanctity for days that have sanctity. And he said the minimum is 3. So that's what we do on Monday, Thursday, Shabbos afternoon. On days where they are weekdays, yet we add in the Musaf service, which would mean Chol HaMoed, the intermediary days of Pesach and Sukkot, and Rosh Chodesh. On those days, because they are of a higher level of sanctity, we read 4 sections, 4 aliyahs. On Yantiv, so this would mean the first and last days of Pesach, first and last days of Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Shavuos, right? All of our holidays, we read 5 aliyahs. We read 5 different sections. On Yom Kippur, which is a elevated Yantiv, we read 6 aliyahs. And on Shabbos, which is the holiest day of all, even though it comes once a week, it's still the holiest day of all, we read 7 aliyahs at least. But since Shabbos is the top, if you want to, you can even add on to 7. Okay, that was the enactment that Ezra made. Now, if you do your math, and I know my father is because he's always crunching numbers, if you do your math, that meant that in the time of Ezra, the average Torah reading was at roughly, give or take, 21 verses, right? It was at least 21 verses, and most likely not much more than that. Now, if you look at the Torah readings today, the shortest Torah reading we have is Parshas Vayelech when it's read separately, and that's 30 verses. Most of the Torah portions we have are upwards of, like this week's portion, I think, is 140, 150 verses, and most of the Parshas and Bereshis are around that, and they're usually at least 100, sometimes a little less, usually a little more. The biggest parsha is Parshas Naso, 176 verses, my bar mitzvah parsha, lucky me. And then we have the double parshas, which are even longer, but be it as it may, we see there's a discrepancy here that Ezra was probably reading weekly Torah readings on Shabbos of roughly 21-ish verses. And today we're reading roughly 100-ish verses. So what gives? What was the change? So, and we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but just to go full circle with the topic is in Ezra's Shabbos Torah reading of roughly 21 verses, if you do your math, it would take roughly 3 to 3.5 years to read through the entire Torah. And again, different communities in Israel developed different customs with if they would read how they would break up the Shabbos reading. But be it as it may, the readings of at least 21 verses or somewhere around there, it would take 3 to 3.5 years to finish the entire Torah. And that was if you ever heard about the concept of the triennial reading of the Torah, by the way, I'm not referring to what the conservative movement does nowadays. They read 1/3 of the traditional Babylonian system that is followed in traditional synagogues every year from a parsha. That is not what was done here. That's something that was made up much later and is not linked here. What Ezra would do is he would go through the Torah in order, but if you're only reading a minimum of 21 verses, it takes 3 to 3.5 years. So that's the concept of the 3-year Torah reading, if you ever heard of it before. We're going to see that after the destruction of the Second Temple, when the Jews once again coalesce in Babylon, that Rav, who will be the leader of the community, will make an enactment to finish the reading of the Torah every year, which is what we do until this day. And that's our, whatever it is, 54 parshas that we have of roughly 100 verses, because that was based on the concept of wanting to finish the Torah every year, as opposed to every 3 to 3.5 years. Again, if you're fascinated in this topic, go ahead, look at that article and get some more information about it. But we move on. So this was some of the things that Ezra did to try and give form to the community, to try and inspire the community. But again, even in the best of circumstances, it was difficult. The Second Temple was not an architecturally impressive building like the First Temple was. Those who saw the First Temple and remembered and came back to see the Second Temple wept because of how physically insignificant it was. A lot of the spiritual aspects of the Second Temple of the First Temple were no longer existent and no longer in existence in the Second Temple. The Ark of the Covenant is not there in the Second Temple, giving us the wonderful Indiana Jones plot of the Raiders of the Lost Ark. It was lost from the time of the First Temple, not there at all in the Second Temple, which, by the way, means that you had in the Second Temple, in the Holy of Holies, there was nothing there. There was the altar and no ark, because there's no ark at this point. So there's no Urim V'Tumim, the special breastplate that the high priest would wear that helped give prophetic messages. That's not there. And we're also told in the First Temple that there was a fire that burnt constantly on the altar that was never extinguished. And that's also not there in the Second Temple. So most miracles are not present anymore. So it's physically not as significant. It's spiritually not significant. And this is part of what Ezra was up against. Okay, so we have Ezra, we have Nehemiah, they secure the Commonwealth, and they finally start to get some traction and finally start to build things up. Now, Ezra, when he was still in Babylon, his title was that he was the head of the Sanhedrin. He was the head of the Jewish court, which after the destruction of the temple had moved to Babylon. Ezra, in an attempt to bolster the community in Israel, he moves the Sanhedrin from Babylon back to Jerusalem. And he is the head of the Sanhedrin. And he gives the Sanhedrin a special name. Now, the Sanhedrin could always have different numbers based on different situations. The number was fluid and varying. It had to be of at least 71, but it could definitely be more than that. Ezra's Sanhedrin was 120 members, and it was referred to as the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, which means the men of the Great Assembly is how it is translated. Now, interestingly enough, when the modern day state of Israel is founded in 1948, they established a British parliamentary government system that we're all probably way too familiar with, and they name their parliament the Knesset. Where did the name Knesset come from? Well, it was borrowed from this idea of the Anshe Knesset Hagadola. The Anshe Knesset Hagadola in antiquity, beginning of the Second Temple, beginning of the modern day state of Israel, the Knesset. The Anshe Knesset Hagadola had 120 members, and that's where in the Knesset in Israel today, that's why they have 120 MKs, members of Knesset, 120 ministers, because the Anshe Knesset Hagadola had 120 members, they have 120 members. The Anshe Knesset Hagadola was made up of many great rabbis, scholars, righteous people, tremendous Talmidei Chachamim, and the Knesset in Israel has 120 members. the Anshe Knesset Gedolah led a spiritual revival of the Jewish people, and the Knesset in Israel has 120 members, right? The comparison ends there. They took the name into the number, and that's it. Nothing else is similar between the Anshe Knesset Gedolah and the Knesset in Israel today. But this was the leading body at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth, which really paved the way for one of these systemic problems throughout the whole Second Commonwealth, and that is that the balance of power is regularly out of whack. I believe that the creators of the concept of the balance of power were not the founding fathers of America, but was actually the Torah, was actually the Almighty. Because the way that Israel, that the nation of the Jews is supposed to be set up, is you're supposed to have a king, the executive branch, if you will. You're supposed to have a Sanhedrin, which is a judicial slash legislative branch. And then you have the kahuna, the priesthood, which is the spiritual branch of government, if you will. But it's supposed to be a balance of power. And those different roles are not supposed to be served by the same people. Now, we see here that Ezra, so to speak, sort of paves the way for a blurring of the balance of powers, because the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah does not only function as the Sanhedrin, but it is also the provincial body of the country. Because, as we mentioned, they couldn't appoint a king. Ezra basically takes his role as leader, his and Nehemiah's role as leader, and spreads it over this body of 120. And that is the provincial head of the government of the Jewish people in Israel. Now, there's two things, I mean, there's really many things, but two very famous things that the Anshe Knesset Gedolah are famous for. Number one, our prayer service as we know it virtually today, again, things have been added in over the generations, but the bare bones, if you will, the bread and butter of the prayer service that we have unto this very day was written, established, codified by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. So when we pray, let's say the Amidah prayer, which is the central part of the Jewish prayer service, all of the Amidah prayers that we have today were written by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. They're written by this body. Now, prayer existed from Abraham, from time immemorial. There's a concept of prayer. But until this point in Jewish history, prayer is completely freestyle. From this point on in Jewish history, there's what we call the Matbeah HaTfilah. There's the set form of prayer established by the men of the Great Assembly. Now, you might ask a question, isn't freestyle much more sincere, much more real, that if a person actually, says what's in their heart and says things in their own words, isn't that a much more real prayer? And I believe the answer is, yeah, it is, but the level of the people had dropped so much that they just couldn't do it anymore. They weren't on that level anymore to be able to connect with the Almighty in prayer through freestyle use of prayer. I mean, I'll challenge you for a minute. The way that these men of the Great Assembly established prayer is that there's three parts of the Amidah. There's the first three blessings are blessings of praise, where we praise the Almighty. The middle 13 are the requests, the bakashos, where we request things of the Almighty. And the final three blessings are blessings of thanksgiving, where we give thanks for the good that we have in our lives. Take a minute, not necessarily right now, but try to praise God in your own words and see how far you get. Oh, God, you are great, and you're amazing, and you're awesome, and you're tremendous. Did I mention you're great? You're really great. Did I mention you're awesome? You're really awesome. And eventually we just sound like we are reading from a thesaurus. But the men of the Great Assembly knew that we had this problem and put words with very deep meaning in there that we should focus on when we praise the Almighty, when we ask the Almighty for what we need, and when we thank the Almighty for what we have. So the prayer service, as we have it today, Shachris Mincha Maariv, on the holidays, adding in Musaf, on Yom Kippur, adding in Ne'ilah, and the form that we have it, that was given to us by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. And then there's something else very significant that they did. Our sages tell us that the spiritual cause of the destruction of the first temple was the fact that the Jewish community was very involved with the three, what we call cardinal sins of Judaism, or as I like to say in Hebrew, the Yahareg va'al Yavor, that the three transgressions of the Torah that somebody would have to give up their life before violating. And they are idol worship, murder, and illicit relationships. So in all those things, those three transgressions or three real areas of transgressions are so severe within Judaism that a person would have to give up their life before being forced to perform an act in one of those three categories. And our sages tell us that this was the root spiritual problem of the First Commonwealth that leads to the destruction of the First Commonwealth. So the men of the Great Assembly said, you know what? We're going to take care of this problem once and for all. What are we going to do? We are going to proclaim days of fasting and prayer in which we will supplicate to the Almighty that the evil inclination inside of every one of us or every one of them at that time to be involved in paganism, polytheism, idol worship should be eradicated. And by the way, that's why when you walk past a Buddha statue, you have no desire to rub his tummy, because the inclination, we have no inclination to be involved in idol worship. The Talmud sort of paints the picture of what this looked like, is that one of the rabbis of the Talmud, Ravina, or Ravashi, I believe, Ravina or Ravashi, I forget which one it was making fun of King Menashe, who he mentioned was one of the idolatrous kings of Judah. And that night, Menashe comes to him in a dream and he says, like, you're making fun of me, you're putting me down. You don't know what kind of desire we had to worship idols in our days. In fact, if you had been alive in those days, you would have picked up the hem of your cloak to run to worship idols. And you're making fun of us? So whatever it was, there was a very intense desire, and that's really the context so we can understand the book of Kings and Samuel and Judges, Kings and Samuel, Judges, Samuel, Kings, if we go in the right order, that we see the Jewish people are always getting tripped up by idol worship. Like, what's the big deal? Like, when was the last time you really felt a desire to bow down to an idol? So the answer is they did have a tremendous desire, and it's not something we can relate to because the men of the Great Assembly was, after these fasts and prayers and supplications, their prayers were answered. And the Talmud describes that a fiery lion came out of the Holy of Holies that they captured and poked out its eye. And again, this is an esoteric story to represent that their prayers were answered, that the inclination to be involved in idol worship had its eye put out, so to speak, and that is the end of the desire for idol worship. And we're going to see at this point in history, in most parts of the world, save the Far East, there is a tremendous decline in paganism. Paganism is about to go bankrupt, and we'll see within a few centuries, it'll be gone, at least from this part of the world. Now, there's something else that happens, though, and that is that the physical world and the spiritual world mirror each other. And just like in the physical world, if I would, pick up my phone right here, what have I created? I've created potential energy. And where have I created more potential energy? If I have my phone here or if I lift up to here, well, obviously there's more potential energy the higher that it is. When it's moving, it's kinetic energy. And when it lands, there's no energy. So the higher something is, the more energy there is in the physical world. That's physics, okay? That's your physics lessons for today. But the spiritual world works exactly in the same way. That the higher something is spiritually, the higher something goes spiritually, the further it can fall, the further the distance is. So when the men of the Great Assembly eradicated the desire for idol worship, they also, so to speak, raised the floor or lowered the ceiling, and therefore made the spiritual heights that people could achieve much closer to the ground, if you will. They lowered the threshold of spirituality that people could reach. So we see that, yes, this was essentially the end of the desire to be involved in idol worship of the Jewish people. But the negative inverse of that is that we see, for the most part, from this point on in Jewish history, there's no more open miracles and there is no more prophecy. From this point on in Jewish history, Judaism is a non-profit organization. because prophecy is a high spiritual achievement. And if the, so to speak, floor was raised, therefore, de facto, the ceiling was lowered, and therefore people could not become prophets anymore. They couldn't achieve that level. They could not reach that level, and there is no more prophecy anymore from this point forward. So we will see that the last of our prophets is somebody by the name of, again, in the book of prophets, or in the book of the book of prophets, the Treyas, the 12 small prophets, it's Malachi. Malachi is the last of the prophets. Malachi is just another name for Ezra, right? So Ezra is our last prophet and mentioned in Tanakh, the very last of the prophecy, with Ezra's death in 313 before the Common Era. That ends the concept of prophecy in the world. Okay. One thing that I mentioned briefly last week, and I did want to say one more thing on before we start to jump into Hellenism and how Hellenism affects the Second Commonwealth, is the concept of the missing 166 years of Jewish history. In other words, the discrepancy between secular historians and Jewish historians as to when either the first temple was destroyed or the Second Commonwealth began, or how long the exile of Babylon was. And I don't want to poo-poo the question, because there is a great rabbi by the name of Rav Schwab, passed away probably 25 years ago or so, who was so bothered by this question of the missing years that he said that the dating system of the Jews was purposely messed up so that we should not calculate the end of days. We should not calculate when the Messianic era is coming. So now again, most do not hold that opinion. Most just hold there's a discrepancy, but it does show that the question is a very serious question. And I believe in previous mentions of that, I didn't give enough weight to the seriousness of the question. It's not just a discrepancy between the secular historians and the Jewish historians. It is a significant question. It's a question mark in the dating system. But bottom line is, we have a very we have something called Seder Olam. We have Maimonides, who give us a straight line from Moses until them, and then we can build from them until us. And if there really are 166 years, it means that that straight line that was meticulously recorded for some reason left out 166 years, which I don't ascribe to. So therefore, that is the simple answer to the concept of 166 years. Yes, it's a discrepancy. Yes, scholars have had to deal with it. But the reason it's such a strong question is because they have their history and we have our history, and both are recorded, at least, ours we believe is recorded accurately, and we don't believe there's a hole in it. So we'll just have to leave it as a question. But again, in this session, we'll be teaching the Jewish years. Okay, so this is the beginning of the Second Commonwealth. Now, what's happening at essentially the same time as we've been talking about is basically at the same time as the Purim story and Persia has come as the powerhouse in the scene. We see that the success and the longevity of the Persians is going to be short-lived, because just as they have risen to the top of the world and conquered most of the known world, we're having another formative foe building their strength, starting to coalesce into a world power. And we're going to see that this power is going to have one of, if not the most profound effect on the Jews from any of the tormentors that we have interacted with up until this point in Jewish history. And I'm, of course, referring to the Greeks, and more specifically to Hellenism. Now, if you ever wondered where the word Hellenism came from, it does not mean that like the Greek philosophy or the Greek country or the Greek world was founded by some lady named Helen. In Greek, the word for Greek or Greece is Helleus. So that's where the word for Greek culture is Hellenism. That's where the word Hellenism comes from. Now, let's describe kind of what was going on at this point, circa the beginning of the 4th century BCE, roughly around the same time the Purim story and the exile of Babylonian exile is happening. What's going on in what would become the Greek Empire? So until this point in history, what we call Greece collectively was a bunch of independent city-states that were separated by water, by mountains. So the geography kept them in many ways apart. We've talked about the Greek islands, the Greek Isles, and they were all of these separate city-states that were virtually always at war with one another, as one would try and gain supremacy over the other one. And many of these names were very famous. We are very well known to us. We have Athens, Macedonia, Rhodes, Sparta. These are all the individual city-states within what will become the Greek Empire. Now, they're always fighting amongst one another, but we're going to see that as Persia comes onto the world scene and conquers the known world, Persia is going to get into the Greek islands and try valiantly to absorb the Greek city-states into their empire, which will be done with moderate success, but not complete success. And we're going to see that eventually the Greeks are going to successfully get the Persians out of, the Greeks will get the Persians out of Persia. So that is when we talk about the Peloponnesian Wars, when we talk about the wars that predated this point, the different civil wars, that is, that a lot of that is what took care of getting the Persians out of Greece. But what's going to happen is that there is going to be a new set of wars in which we're going to have a new power, a new force in one of the city-states start to exert himself, and that is none other than Philip II of Macedon. So Philip II of Macedon is going to successfully be really the first one to successfully conquer and unite all of the, or most of the Greek city-states. Now, he is from Macedon, and he is going to be challenged quite regularly by Sparta. Sparta is going to constantly try to get the upper hand over Macedon, Athens, the Philip II alliance, or the Delian League, as opposed to the Peloponnesian League, which was Sparta. And it's going to be a struggle, but we're going to see in the end, Philip II is going to be successful. And then, as we'll talk about more next week, his son Alexander will be even more successful and finally uniting the Greek Isles, the Greek city-states, into one empire. Now, what was fascinating is even though until the point of Philip II of Macedon or Alexander the Great, his son, even though these city-states were independent, one similarity that united them all together at some level was their culture. This culture of Hellenism permeated throughout the different city-states, even though they're always at war with one another, one was trying to conquer the other. The culture was developed amongst all of them. What we call the Hellenistic culture, Hellenism, was developed amongst all or most of these city-states, for sure, Athens, Sparta, and Macedon, these major ones. This is where we see Greek culture, especially Athens is probably the most famous for Greek culture, for Hellenism to start to surface. Now, many will say that Hellenism was the beginning of philosophy in the world, that the Greeks created philosophy. There's only one problem, that according to Jewish sources, we had philosophy long before this point in history. And where do we have it, or where do we see it? Well, none other than Shlomo HaMelech, than King Solomon. We see King Solomon wrote Koheles, or Ecclesiastes, which was a book of philosophy. He wrote Proverbs or Mishlei, which was a book of philosophy. Song of Songs was a book of philosophy. So he was a philosopher. So I would like to say that he was the father of philosophy. And not only that, but our sages tell us that when Solomon was alive, that the Chachmei Altuna, that the wise men of Athens traveled to Jerusalem to learn from Solomon. So as much as the Greeks want to say that they brought philosophy to the world, I would like to say they learned it from King Solomon and then transmitted it to their people. And the founding father, if you will, of Hellenistic philosophy is somebody by the name of Socrates. And Socrates has a student by the name of Plato, and Plato has a student by the name of Aristotle. And Aristotle becomes the most influential person in the world, probably for 2,000 years, if not more, because the way that he organizes and teaches and brings his philosophy to the world is the Aristotelian philosophy will permeate through everything. And it won't be until modern times that we'll see that many of the concepts that Aristotle put forth are finally questioned or finally disproven by science in many senses, and other philosophies start to replace Aristotelian philosophy. But we're going to see it lasts for a very long time, and it will last at a certain level within Judaism for a very long time. And it won't really be until the days of Maimonides, which will be about 1,500 years later, that we will truly reconcile Judaism and Aristotelian philosophy at some level. So this is the time when Aristotle is organizing the philosophy of the Hellenistic philosophy, and it will have a tremendous, tremendous effect on the Jewish people, both positive and negative. Now, there's one, the fourth and final Greek philosopher I want to mention is a Greek philosopher by the name of Epicurus. So Epicurus had a philosophy, which when I was a kid, it was made famous by the Dave Matthews Band, if you're familiar with them, that they had a song, "Eat, Drink, and Be Merry, for Tomorrow We Die." And that, I don't know if Epicurus ever said those exact words. He probably didn't say them in English. If he said them, he said them in Greek. But this was, in short, the philosophy of Epicurus, of the Epicurean philosophy. Now, a lot of times the concept of Epicurean is linked together with indulgences. I know in Miami, where my wife grew up, there's a very high-end fancy grocery store called Epicurean. There's a line of cooking products called Epicurean that a lot of times it means indulgence, enjoying the world. Epicurus did not believe in indulging. He did not think it was right to indulge, but he did not believe in the world to come, and he did not believe in the concept of reward and punishment. So he didn't think you should have a conscience. In other words, you shouldn't indulge, but whatever you do, you also shouldn't feel bad about it, because there's no reward and punishment and there is no afterlife. And that is an oversimplification or a quick summary of the Epicurean philosophy. Now, why do I single out Epicurus? Because if you think about it, if you know a little Jewish, the word Epicurus, which is a Greek word, sounds very much like a Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word I am referring to is the word Epicurus. Who's ever heard the Hebrew word Epicurus? It sounds strikingly similar to Epicurus. That's because it is the same word. Now, when we speak Jewish, when we talk Hebrew, what does the word Epicurus mean? That is the Hebrew word for a heretic, for a denier of Judaism, right? DM through in the chat there, right? An Epicurus is a heretic, someone who denies Judaism. That's what we call them. That is the traditional term. If you had a Bubba or Zeta or a parent that spoke Yiddish, I'm sure you heard the word Epicurus in your house, right? And it's always a joke of when something is heretical, we say that's Epicurus. Very, very common word in Jewish vernacular. And what is the word? What's the source of it? Epicurus, Epicurean. Because this philosophy of Epicurus, the Epicurean philosophy, is the antithesis to what it means to be a Jew. First of all, it goes against two of Maimonides' 13 principles of Jewish faith: the idea of reward and punishment, the idea of the world to come, very fundamental Jewish ideas. And Epicurus's whole philosophy was saying that none of that existed. So at this time period, when we're going to see there's a collision between the Jews and the Greeks, between Hellenism and Judaism, we're going to see that the Epicurean philosophy is going to have an impact on Jews, so much so that that becomes the Jewish word for the heretic. We call him the Epicurus. That's what we call him, naming them after the Epicurean philosophy or the philosopher Epicurus. So that's where that comes from. Okay. So the philosophy starts to permeate the world, and we see that there's three major contributions of the Greek influence on the world, and two major places where philosophy is expounded. Number one was the gymnasium. The gymnasium was not just a place where they went to perform sports. It was a place where they would sit all day. They would do sports, but also sit around and talk of philosophy. They would sit around in the nude, and yes, they would perform many other illicit activities in the gymnasium. Now, the gymnasium was only for men, so yes, those illicit activities were happening only with the men in the gymnasium. That was a big part of Greek culture, and it was a very indulging society on many levels, and a lot of things happened there in the gymnasium, the spreading the Greek philosophy, and because one of the many things they worshipped in Greek culture was the human body. And that's why in the gymnasium they did not wear clothing. And we're going to see that as Hellenism starts to have an impact on the Jewish people, that there's going to be a lot of Jews who want to become Hellenized, who want to become Hellenistic. And there's going to be the Talmud describes a very painful surgical process that many Jews who want to become Hellenized would go through. And that would be to basically undo their circumcision. I'll spare the gory details of how they would do that, but needless to say, it was a very painful procedure. And because when they were going to the gymnasium in the nude, they didn't want to be obvious that they were Jewish and different and believed in something different. So we're going to see that as the Greek influence starts to make its way into the Second Commonwealth, we're going to see the gymnasium start to show up in Israel. And the other place where Greek philosophy was often expounded upon was in the theaters. This is, we have the famous Greek playwrights. First, we mentioned before, Socrates was a playwright. Euripides, many of these famous Greek playwrights would write the tragedies and the comedies and whatnot to give over these Greek philosophies. And all this is going to take the Jewish world by storm, because there is a well-known fact when it comes to Jewish assimilation, which we're no strangers to in Jewish history, but that is Jews never really have a desire to assimilate down. In other words, if they perceive a culture to be less culture than Jewish culture, there's no desire of the Jews to go down to that culture. In other words, when the Jews were living in Poland, they did not have a desire to be Polish peasants, right? When they were living in the Russian Empire, they did not have a desire to be Russian peasants. But when they were living in Germany and the German world becomes more civilized and educated, there is a tremendous desire of the Jews to follow after the German society. And that's exactly what happens for the first time in world history. By the way, I can relate to this coming from Atlanta, Georgia. The Jews in Atlanta, Georgia have no desire to be Southern Hicks. We just don't. Right? That's not where we want to be. But this we're going to see really for the first time in world history when the Greeks come along, because the Jews lived in Egypt. They didn't really want to be Jew. We saw that they do end up assimilating, but it wasn't a striving for culture. It was other circumstances. And when the Jews go to Babylon, they don't really want to be like the Babylonians. They for sure don't want to be like the Persians. But once the Greeks come along with all this culture and philosophy and whatnot, we're going to see it's going to take the Jewish world by storm, and it's going to cause all kinds of conflict that will last literally throughout the Second Commonwealth. So it's interesting that as the Second Commonwealth is getting off the ground, that's the exact same time in world history when Greece is starting to unite, when Philip II of Macedon finally unites the Greek city-states to a certain extent, making it into one kingdom. And next week, we will meet the one who will finally, one of the things that Philip II is successful in, he gets Persia out of Greece once and for all, because they were brought back in by the Peloponnesians, by Sparta, to try and help them against Philip. And there's an old concept we're going to see time and time again, that when you invite the bear for lunch, he stays for dinner. So the Persians didn't want to leave. We're going to see that Philip gets rid of the Persians from Greece, and after he is killed, we're going to see his son Alexander takes over, Alexander the Great, who will conquer the Persian Empire and conquer the whole known world, and with him will come Hellenism. So one last point on the rise of the Greeks, which will really jump into the intersection of the Greeks and the Jews next week, but as we just said, Philip II was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, and he was killed by Pasaya, P. Where is it here? Sorry, have it here in my notes. Pausanias, his bodyguard, personal bodyguard. So Philip II was assassinated at his daughter's wedding by Pausanias, one of his personal bodyguards. And according to some historians, he was put up to the job by one of his wives, Olympias, and her son, who's none other than Alexander. Because what had happened through another wife that Philip had taken, that there was the threat to the throne, that the threat to the heir that Alexander wanted, his mother wanted for him. So actually, Olympias was banished from the kingdom, or went into a self-proclaimed exile. Actually, Alexander went with her, and according to many opinions, they actually plotted in the assassination of Philip II. So be it as it may, when we start next week, we're gonna meet Alexander the Great. We're gonna talk about how in his conquering of the world, he will come to Israel at the end of this time period that we've talked about today, the end of the Men of the Great Assembly. And with that, we'll see the Greek influence start to take over in Israel, and that struggle that will go on for many, many centuries. I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you for listening. Any questions? I see a few here in the chat box. I'll just go back in order here. So yeah, that's where the triennial concept came from, as we discussed before. The miracle of Beitar, that's after the destruction of the Second Temple, but that's more what we call a hidden miracle. When we said there's no more miracles at this point, there is no more open miracles. So 5782 is the year we are in right now. Again, Rav Schwab, like I said, he dealt with these 166 years, but we don't know really if the years were really changed or not, according to what he says. But we stick to our, years, and that's what we believe is accurate. Were the Medes and Persians the pre-Islamic region on the moon in 3 daughters? I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that question about the Persians. I don't, as far as being a pre-Islamic religion, it's yes and no. And we'll get to the rest of Islam. I see you raise your hand, Dan. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask something?
So one of the questions I was asking, and you explained, had to do with the Greeks, and that it sounded like maybe they built some of their understanding comprehension upon Judaism. So that made me think, well, I wonder what these Medes and Persians, I remember sometime I heard a teaching that they brought something to the world. I can't remember what it was. I wonder what the religion was. And then before Islam, there was this.
Zoroastrianism was the main Persian religion. So that's that's what we know of. But we'll talk about the decline of Persia, but when we talk about the religion of Zoroastrianism, if that answers your question, I don't know if that does or not. Oh, it does. I said thank you. Okay, cool. Glad I answered. Okay, any other questions before we wrap it up? Yes, go Braves, Mom. I agree. Okay, well, I thank you all for coming. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you all next Wednesdays. We'll talk about the rise of the Greeks in Israel and the Greek influence in Israel, and everyone have a wonderful evening.